Hey there guys, welcome back to the channel. So my name is Shivank and I'm a second year medical student at Imperial College London, and today's video is all about last minute UCAT tips for the 2023 exam. So this video will be split up into two different sections. I'll firstly be talking about tips that can work for the entirety of the exam, and then I'll be talking about each individual section in detail and what tips I think will work for each of these sections. So without further ado, let's get started. So firstly, about tips for the whole exam. And a tip which you're going to hear me say throughout this video is practice, practice, practice. The more you practice for this exam, the easier it gets, and you will hear this from all the students that have done the UCAT before, because it really will help and will help develop your confidence for the actual exam. A great resource for this, and no, this video is not sponsored, is Medify. I think Medify is really great because it has a wide range of questions for you to access, and the idea within Medify, you have a progress tracker. So you can see how many questions you're attempting each day, and you can track your progress along a certain amount of time. So for example, a couple of months or 1 or 2 months before the actual UCAT exam, I was just familiarizing myself with what the exam actually entailed, what the different sections were, and how I was going to tackle it. Then as it got closer and closer towards the exam, I was making sure I did more questions in timed conditions compared to untimed conditions previously. And then towards the final couple of days, I was doing as many mock exams as I could and making sure that I was maximizing the amount of questions I did. And it's also kind of rewarding in a way to see your progress and to see how many questions you're attempting and to see it hopefully increase over time. So that's why I'd highly recommend using Medify. Moreover, this is something which if you already be doing, great, but if not, I would highly recommend you implement this. So this is the idea of using keyboard shortcuts, and I cannot stress how important this is. So many students might say, no, it's just easier for me to just move the cursor and then open the calculator and then you just type the numbers in. However, it adds up. The more you use your cursor, the more time it takes. But if you just instantly do Alt-C, or for example to flag, you do Alt-F instantly, it will save time. And who knows, maybe that couple of seconds extra saved could help you, could make the difference between 720 or 740, for instance. And so it's really important that you try and use these keyboard shortcuts. If by any means you still don't feel comfortable with it, I would then suggest just going with what you feel comfortable, what you've been doing. But if you still have time before your exam, just make sure you try and use the keyboard shortcuts, or at least use the flagging method, because many students, what they do in the exam, especially because they're nervous, they're more likely to flag more questions than they have in their mock exams, which is perfectly fine. I myself did as well. But flagging the questions using the keyboard shortcut already provided of Alt-F really does save time, and it's much better than having to move your cursor. And so I really recommend using your keyboard shortcuts for the exam. And finally, something which sounds obvious and many students don't do is the idea of focusing on your strengths rather than your weaknesses. So for instance, for me, I found taxes questions in quantitative reasoning quite difficult. And so what I used to do is whenever the quantitative reasoning came, I would have a quick glance at the taxes question and then see that, okay, this is going to be quite complicated and a lot of steps involved. I will then simply move on to other questions in that section, and then if I have time, come back to the taxes question. Bear in mind that because UCAT is very time pressured, don't leave it blank because you don't want to lose marks unnecessarily. So I'll just put a random option, then flag it, and then move on instantly. This way, you'll maximize the amount of marks you get, because something which you're more strong on, you're more likely to get right, and then when you have more time at the end, then you can come back. Whereas if you did the other way around and focus on your weaknesses first, there's a chance you might miss out on an easy question which you could have easily got a couple of marks for. And hence, I would highly recommend when revising, obviously focus on your weaknesses, make sure you understand that fully, but at the actual exam, make sure you just do your strengths and then come back to your weaknesses afterwards. And also linking into this is the idea when guessing questions, try and make educated guesses as well, as easy as it sounds. So for example, if one of the options were, let's say you've done a bit of a part of the calculation and your answer is 500 and you know it has to be more than 500. If you look at the answer options and two of them are, let's say, 200 and one's 300, you know instantly you can eliminate A and B. Whilst you don't know with the other options because they're all more than 500, at least you have a better chance of guessing 1 and 3 compared to 1 and 5, for instance. And so I really recommend, even if you don't fully get the answer to the question, try and attempt it if you think it's doable, and then if you get stuck, just make an educated guess based on what you have and looking at the answer options. That's why as we go on to different sections, I highly recommend looking at the questions and then moving on to the extract rather than doing the other way around. So now let's focus on the different sections and tips I can provide for each of these. So for quantitative reasoning, this is a section which is very maths heavy as described by the name. And so for this, it's really important that your mental math skills is really good. The idea that if I ask you to do 52 times 8, you should be easily able to come up with, okay, that is 416. Something like that is very important to do in the actual exam because it will really help you save time rather than having to put in the calculator. So for example, 8 times 52, it will take a lot of time to do. Whereas if you do it just mentally, 8 times 50 is 400, 8 times 2 is 16, 416. And whilst as obvious as it sounds, in the actual exam, this will save you a lot of time because putting all these numbers in a calculator and using the calculator function can be time consuming. And so the more you improve your mental math skills, the less likely you are to make a mistake when transferring numbers, and the quicker it also becomes. And again, linking to the point that I mentioned before, the idea of make sure you focus on your strengths. The idea, if you find taxes quite difficult in quantitative reasoning, don't start off with this, start with other sections first and then move on to this. However, with taxes, it usually is identifying key terms. So for example, one question can describe, now find the person's annual taxable income. And this can differentiate between another question which says, now find the patient's annual income. And the word taxable and annual income are very different in the idea that certain people, for example, have 12,000, let's say, that is not taxed. And so just one word can change the entire passage of taxes questions, which is why I personally didn't like it. And so with quantitative reasoning and with every section, it's really important that you notice these keywords and don't get caught up by that. And something that I would say for quantitative reasoning, which again can be quite controversial, is when doing your calculations, try and be quick, but at the same time make sure you're thorough. So if you think you're spending a bit more time than you should, that's perfectly fine in my opinion, because it's worse to come up with an answer at the end that is completely wrong because you've done a calculation wrong at the very beginning. And so if you're very thorough with your steps, if you want to write it down, that helps, that's perfectly fine, but just make sure that you avoid careless mistakes. And so don't rush through it immediately, try and take your time, but obviously be pragmatic with your time. The idea, if you're spending too long on a question and you're not getting anywhere with it, there's no point sticking with that question, just move on. But make sure that your mental math skills is really good, otherwise one silly mistake can make the whole question wrong and make you lose a lot of time that could be saved. Okay, so now let's move on to verbal reasoning tips. So this is the section which many students do struggle with, and that's fine. The idea that it is quite a difficult section, and the main reason for that is that it's a big extra that's provided to you, and many students might get overwhelmed by it and not know what to do. However, the key thing to do in this section is the idea that, for me personally, is I used to read the questions first and then read the extract. This is because when you read the questions, you already know what to identify from the extract. So let's say it talks about where was Winston Churchill born, and the extract mentions it just in one sentence. If you had read the whole extract, you would have wasted a lot of time, whereas one sentence says, and now we move on to the birthplace of Winston Churchill, which is Blenheim Palace, for instance. And so it's really important that you read the questions first, because then you know what you're looking for. And this also links on to verbal reasoning, the idea of name, animal, place, thing. So whenever you see any of the answer options in verbal reasoning, so for example, again, Winston Churchill, it's very easy to scan that name in the entire extract because it'll stand out to you. Whereas if it didn't have a name or animal or place thing, it was very difficult to identify what you're looking for when scanning the text. And so 9 out of 10 verbal reasoning questions, when asking to look for something, will have that name, will have a significant thing that you can just refer to from the extract. Furthermore, with verbal reasoning, I think it's really important to read the question. So one of the questions could be, what is the best conclusion of the passage? And so you may have two answer options at the end, which both seem right, but only one of them will actually be the best conclusion. For example, let's say there's 3 paragraphs. One of the conclusions is only referring to one paragraph, whereas another one can refer to all 3 paragraphs. And so obviously in this case, the one that refers to all 3 paragraphs is the best conclusion. And so for the conclusion questions, I would highly recommend reading all the answer options, because you want to make sure that you're not missing out anything that could be a better conclusion. Also, in verbal reasoning, make sure you look out for mitigating words. So you might ask what mitigating words are. These are words such as perhaps, maybe, possibly, etc. So these words are words to try and throw you off, the idea that it's not definitive. So if the answer option said that thousands of people will definitely be coming to Buckingham Palace. So here it's not using a definitive word because we've said it definitely will be coming to Buckingham Palace. Whereas the extract says thousands of people may come to Buckingham Palace. So these are two different statements. The idea may come to Buckingham Palace and will definitely come to Buckingham Palace. They are not the same. The idea thousands may come, but that, okay, so millions could also come, or hundreds could come. Whereas this, it says thousands will come, is only thousands. It cannot be any other possibility. And so make sure you always look out for mitigating words because it can completely change whether a statement is true or whether a statement is false. And also a tip which I think really helped, if a sentence uses words such as always, definitely, it must be, etc., it's more likely to be false than true. I don't always go by this. It's just whenever I've seen an extract, if someone says it will always happen this case, and when the answer option, sorry, it's usually quite strongly put forward, and so it's unlikely to be true. So now let's talk about abstract reasoning. So abstract reasoning is one of the sections which I quite enjoyed. The idea that it is quite a lot of skill involved. The idea that you have to find patterns really quickly and then apply it to all the other shapes in order to identify the answer options. But some tips can really help with abstract reasoning. So firstly, with abstract reasoning, let's say you have set A and set B. And set A, you have, let's say, 6 squares. The simplest square in set A will be applicable to all other squares. So let's say the pattern is you always have one circle no matter what. In set A, one of the boxes only has one circle, and the other boxes have like loads of different shapes. Obviously, all of them also having one circle. If you look at just the simplest box in shape A, you know instantly that, okay, every single square must have a circle because the simplest box has a circle. And so it's really helpful to look at the simplest box because then you can extrapolate it and identify the pattern really easily this way. And usually the pattern you find in set A, it will be the opposite of the pattern you find in set B, or something that is kind of the opposite. So for example, in set A, all the shapes are shaded, whereas in set B, it's most likely to be all the shapes are unshaded. Or in set A, all the shapes are squares. So obviously there's no real opposite, but in set B, all the shapes are triangles. So you can see that there's a sort of link between them, but it's kind of the opposite link, which is really helpful. Another thing which I think really helps with timings for abstract reasoning, and something that I used personally, is the idea that focus on getting 2 patterns, because usually there's 2 patterns for the abstract reasoning in order to get the answer option. So for example, where does this shape fit into these sets? However, if you are running low on time, I would highly recommend finding one pattern. So obviously, let's say you have some amount of time for each abstract reasoning question. Use that time. But if you feel like you're going well over your time, just move on instantly with that one pattern you found. Because usually that one pattern will be very obvious. So for example, all the shapes are shaded. And then when you go to the answer options, instead of getting 5 out of 5, if you had found the both patterns, you get 3 out of 5. But I think this is much better rather than spending your entire time trying to find a second pattern when it would waste a lot of time that could be used for a different question again. So just to reiterate the 2 points of abstract reasoning, as it can be quite, as I've described quite complexly, the idea that first, find the simplest box, I think is very important because the same pattern will be applicable for all. And then secondly, find at least one pattern. If you're running out of time, 2 is the best, but find at least one pattern because you're most likely to get most of the marks still. Finally, for SJT. So SJT is something that's very important, and it's the final section of the UCAT. It has a separate band on its own. And what I would say for SJT is to try and make your own notes from the questions that have been provided. So firstly, the idea that you can refer to the GMC guidelines. Don't read the entire book. There's a highlighted GMC guidelines which tells you the key principles that you need to know for the exam, and it can be really helpful to have that at the forefront. But also when doing questions, and when, for example, in Medify it gives you explanations, note down key things for the explanation. So it might say that put the patient forward, and that's the case for every single example. So whenever you have issue saying, let's say a patient that's coming to the hospital complaining, and how important is it to address the patient, you know it's of the highest importance to address the patient, because within medicine, patient is the utmost priority. And there might be things that are obvious. So, for example, the idea if a doctor's drinking alcohol, obviously we know that's not acceptable. The idea that confidentiality is very important within medicine. But there may be ethics which is not as obviously listed. And so I would say note down all the key points that you learned from your SJT questions, and so you at least have a bank that you can refer to on the day. I found this really helpful because on the day of my exam, I just referred to the SJT questions that I got wrong or the key points I mentioned, and then in the actual exam, I was able to do really well because of that. The final section I'll be talking about now is decision making. And decision making is something that is really suited for each person. So for me, I'm quite a visual learner. So with decision making, when they describe it, I used to draw it visually. So for example, it said person A lives in this house. I used to draw a square as a house and then be like, and it says person B lives 2 houses away. So then dot 2 boxes, draw another house, etc. And I think it's whatever helps for you. But I think it's really important to focus on your strengths, especially for that. If you can do it in your head, that's great. But I think it's much easier to write it down because then you won't miss out any detail. And it forces your brain to work out the actual answer rather than having to force your brain to memorize what's listed in the box, if that makes sense. And so it's really important. Again, with decision making, it's very easy to be caught out because there's a lot of things that can try and trick you with it. The idea that it can simply get very confusing, and then you try and spend a lot of time on it and then realize you've wasted a lot of time that could be used for other questions. And so it's really important that you keep track of time with all the sections. And so with decision making, I think the main tip is the idea of focus on your strengths and also focus on your mental maths, because a lot of overlap does happen with quantitative reasoning in the idea that if you had quick mental math skills, some of the questions, it can help. So overall, just to summarize what I've presented today, the idea that for the UCAT, the most important thing is to practice, because no matter what, you will get better at the UCAT with more practice you do. Make sure you familiarize yourself with all the sections before the exam, and make sure that even if you do feel nervous in the exam, it's perfectly normal to. Just know that you've learned everything and you've done everything to your utmost capability, and so you'll be perfectly fine in the exam. I just wanted to say that the videos will be more frequent now. I've just been focusing on studies this year, just making sure to get through the year, and now I'll be coming up with helpful UCAT videos for you guys, and hopefully provide you with a crash course for you guys shortly soon. So thank you guys for watching, and stay tuned.